Thank you so much for joining us today. And before we move on to the issue, I would like to ask you to introduce yourself briefly and your organization.
Okay, thank you very much for having me here. It's a privilege and a great honor. I am Joyce Msuya. I am the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator for UN OCHA, which is really the Office of Coordinating for Humanitarian Assistance globally. And I'm based in New York since February of this year.
What about your organization? What is your priorities and what is the main mission of your organization?
I mean, simply put, the main mission is really to save lives. If you look at the crisis in the world from Ukraine to Somalia to Yemen, actually I would say three main objectives of the organization. One is advocating for humanitarian assistance. For example, the Republic of Korea is one of the strongest supporters to humanitarian work globally. So advocacy for humanitarian assistance is one. Second is mobilizing resources to support humanitarian partners and community. And then third is forming partnerships. And it's not just a UN mandate. We work with NGOs, local and international, as well as other UN partners. So it's a big family.
Yeah. In coping with this humanitarian crisis, there are a lot of actors like government, international organizations, and civil societies. Among these actors, civil society organization in Korea is playing an important role. And I think it must be the same in the global context. And this, as like KCOC's platform organization of these civil society organizations working in this humanitarian area. And as the OCHA, I believe, has a similar responsibility of this orchestrating all these different groups. And what are the most challenging aspect of this, having a leadership in all these different parties?
So, you know, I tend to look at a glass half full rather than empty. For me, when I was considering a career change, one of the aspects that attracted me to OCHA was exactly what you pointed out, that it's UN agencies working hand in hand with other partners, including international and local NGOs. Now, from a leadership perspective, this is the way I see it. One is NGO, civil society organization, and I want to thank KCOC for having such a platform for Korean NGOs. You bring validity to the work of multilateral organizations. You bring complementarity because you're on the ground. When I met some of the Korean CSOs, for example, they were working in Poland at the borders, with Ukrainian refugees. But there are others working, for example, here in Asia Pacific. So it's that complementarity to the UN system that is pretty much good. I think the other aspect is for some areas, UN agencies have constrained access to areas where there are massive humanitarian needs. And for the most part, we depend on civil society organizations to deliver assistance. So for me, I think it's a rewarding partnership. And it's not just international NGOs, but equally important local NGOs. The CSOs I met through your very nice platform, I was also impressed by the breadth of their work. There are some who are working in Asia Pacific, but maybe from bringing some ideas to humanitarian country teams. There are others that are delivering basic services and others focusing on women.
I believe we are living in an age of humanitarian crisis right now. And I'm wondering, what is your assessment of this current situation? Because it's quite unprecedented aspect we are facing right now. So I wonder, what's your assessment as a head of this very important responsibility in the United Nations?
Yeah, I mean, first I have to say the current situation is quite daunting, the scale of the challenge. I mean, what we currently have is what I would say old crises. Crises such as Yemen, Syria, that have gone on for so many years, over a decade for some. And then what we are seeing globally is, for example, the climate change issues that are driving humanitarian crises. We saw the recent floods in Pakistan, for example, the famine in the Horn of Africa. So there are new crises that are driven by climate change, by economic collapse. For example, if you look at Lebanon, Sri Lanka, and there's a lot of human suffering. At the moment, my organization, the UN OCHA, is estimating we have 340 million people in need just for 2022.
Yeah.
So the scale of the challenge is massive. And then we have pretty much limited resources to respond to the needs. I think the other aspect is we are seeing more partnerships that are coming. What gives me hope is the fact that you have private sector. We saw it in Ukraine, for example, where they have donated significant amount of resources in support of humanitarian. NGOs, I mean, here in Korea, the role that civil society, Korean civil society organization. So what gives me hope is the partnership, this sense of coming together as a village to save lives.
I see.
Yeah.
Nowadays, so many people are really worried about our challenges we are facing, like a declining democracy and declining this global consensus of this that we had for the previous decades. And what worries you most nowadays when you watch this, the situation?
I think for me, when I sit down sometimes, what worries me, because there are so many crises, is whether there is a risk of becoming numb to suffering.
Too indifferent to the those agony, right?
Yeah, sort of being fatigued. By gosh, there are so many crises.
Take it for granted.
Exactly, exactly. So for me, the way I counter that is by traveling and seeing and bring the reality check and seeing how I can help, for example, Korean CSOs or other NGOs to do their, but that worries me. And then two is the ability to respond to crisis, because there are so many humanitarian crises. So many. I mean, even when you go to one country, when you leave the capital and go to the field, the situation is worse. So the numbness and becoming used to suffering is what worries me.
So that's the greatest source of frustration that you are having, right?
Yeah, because I'm also, I'm an impatient optimist by nature. So I go back to sometimes the spirit of wanting to do things immediately, but also realizing as I'm getting older, what will happen, Yeah.
The pandemic is accelerating the speed of changes. What is your views on coping with this accelerating speed of change of society and environment? Because the reason why I'm asking you this question is the humanitarian crisis is somehow accelerated by this the surrounding environment. So to cope with this humanitarian crisis effectively, I think we have to have a clear views on this surrounding the speed of change of society.
So I think in a way, the pandemic was a double-edged sword. I mean, if I look at the work of humanitarians, they never stopped. I mean, if I think of NGOs and others, they never really stopped from saving lives. So for me, it shows the deep commitment of humanitarian partners because of the pandemic. If I look at OCHA, for example, there was innovation that came naturally. For example, how do you use technology to monitor things because people could not travel, etc. And we're trying to see how we can capitalize on that. I think for me, what worries me is also the pandemic added to the already compounded menu of crises.
The complexity.
The complexity. And then, let's be honest, most countries also have suffered through the pandemic, through the economic slowdown. So when I talk about financing and the support, for example, from donors to humanitarians, they're still catching up. And unfortunately, there was another war, which has also taken attention to. So those are the, but you know, what I would say is that hope is the currency of humanitarians, so you can't lose hope. Yeah.
So the slowdown of this global economy and this uncertainty of the future makes us focus on the immediate agenda or personal agenda only, not just this global or the global context or humanitarian crisis. Even though we are watching from the media, we are blinded in a way because we are so focused on this immediate economic situation. And this is one of my frustration, that how can we change this perspective from this immediate needs of personal needs to a more the wider and bigger issue. So,
like you mean long term?
Long term, and this a global issue which goes beyond this local perspective.
I mean, I think it's a very good question, and I think my answer would be it's a balancing act. I mean, if you look at, I've been in Korea now for 4 days. In all my conversations that I've had here, they've been a mix of, you know, domestic issues, but also what Korea as a state can do globally, including supporting humanitarian work, but also the partnerships. So I think one has to take a medium long-term view in addition to taking a short-term perspective. I do think that's where possibly the young generation can also hold us to account. I mean, if you look at what happened in COP27 in Egypt, there were young and youth people reminding us, an older generation, that time is running out. And that also sometimes pushes policymakers, politicians to take a medium and long-term view. And for me, you look at Korea, Korea is housing quite a number of climate focused organizations, from the Green Climate Fund, the Global Green Growth Institute. Climate change is very important for this country. So the young people can also advocate for medium and long-term solutions, including in humanitarian situations, in addition to focusing on the domestic part.
I see.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that there's a gap between this rising demand in humanitarian crisis and also the relatively limited resources that we have. The gap is widening, and I think it is one of the major problems we are facing in this field. And what do you think is the ways that we can overcome these barriers, the gap between these two? And how can you, I mean, the narrowing this gap between these two?
I mean, if I could give 3 specific ideas where I think can start to narrow the gap. One is we have to expand our partnerships. For example, if you look at most of the human sufferings across the globe, I'm generalizing, you have humanitarian community that is responding to save lives. If we can work more closely with, for example, development institutions as part of humanitarian and development nexus, then we can crowd in more financing from other sources to respond to the humanitarian needs. I think there is massive opportunities to engage with the private sector. Now, for most companies, they have a sense of duty, a sense of giving back to communities. So how do we attract them to come and work with us to save lives? But there we need a little bit more work to say what type of a difference can they really make in the world. I think the other aspect is to look at local NGOs. Most countries, just like here, I have seen civil society, you're seeing a booming of local actors, community leaders, organizations that are welcoming refugees, for example, or internally displaced people into their homes. So I think partnerships and looking at it differently is one area. The second is innovation. By and large, if you look at the last 2 decades, the humanitarian community has been doing a great job. But now, for example, with the power of technology and ICT.
As far as technology is concerned, Korea is one of the leading countries in this area. And what do you see as, I'm interested in what Korea can do in these innovation sectors in coping with this humanitarian crisis in the global context.
Yeah, so I think, one of the aspects that I would like to add here, I had a privilege to live in this beautiful country for 3 years with my husband and 2 children. And what I saw is, one, the miracle on the Han River, how Korea transformed itself within 1 generation. So globally, including in my own country, Tanzania, there is a huge admiration of Korea as a country that can act as a bridge between developing country and developed world. Because now it's a developed world, a donor, but there is an aspiration from the Korean story. And that is a huge asset globally. Now, specifically, what can Korea do? Just based on that history, Korea can bring the voice of reason to platforms such as G20 to talk about humanitarian. I mean, it's interesting, we're meeting here and there is a G20 meeting in Bali. So the Republic of Korea can speak credibly about what is it like and relevant for developing countries, but link it to developed country because of its history.
Yeah.
I think the second is the power of innovation and transformation. I mean, when I lived here and looking at what companies such as Samsung, LG, and others have done, not just for Korea, but also now going globally, I wonder whether they can even play more of a leadership role to bring some of these ICT, digital transformation, innovation to the humanitarian space, building on the point that I explained earlier.
Yeah, I see.
And then the third, I would say, one thing I have also appreciated is Korean talent, the value of education. So having more Korean nationals being engaged in international organizations or in humanitarian work.
The gap between the resource and these needs, and this is one of our important challenges we are facing in this area. And this, to narrowing this gap, there must be something unique about Korea as a nation and Korean people that we can make a difference, make some kind of contribution in this area. And do you see any specific?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, especially coming to Korea this time, there may be 2 opportunities. I'm really inspired by the generational drive, and how the young generation, the young Koreans, can help to close the need between the finances. And that could be through working through contribution, through joining CSOs and going to work, because we need as much help as we can in terms of contribution. I think the other is the private sector. For example, when I lived here, I realized even when I was working for the World Bank, most of the Korean conglomerates have the willingness of giving, you know, whether it's through corporate social responsibility at the time. So now how do we capitalize on that? But also how, for example, we show the private sector can engage. What the Ukraine war taught us, including OCHA, is the power of the private sector, the contributions that came just from private individuals and companies to wanting to help, to make life better, was immense. So I think here there is immense opportunities for the private sector. Just like the Samsungs, the LGs have managed to go out, can we build on that to do more giving towards humanitarian work to close that gap?
Yeah.
And then lastly, partnerships. I was quite impressed, given per capita the small size of some of the CSOs here, but what they're trying to do. Some are operating under $50,000 US, but they're in places where humanitarian assistance is needed. Yeah. So more CSOs coming, and if there is anything we can do to help, we'll be happy to do it.